some research that Danica and I are currently working on right now in terms of change management within sport organizations. Just a few things just to comment on is that we look at this at multiple levels. Dan, to your point, who's coming into the program, what's happening at the top, so top down, and Nicole just finished off her MBA, so you'd be familiar with this with Henry Mintzberg, top down approach and bottom up. I mean, the students are coming in from the bottom, hopefully bringing in a new culture. But currently right now, from the top management down, and then in the middle, the meso level, which is really the policies and the guidelines and what the organizations are making, and down to the micro level, which is the individuals and who you're hiring. There's kind of these three levels of thinking, and the senior executive level and what they want to do, and if it's a real effort. But then there's also this whole concept of the actual corporate change management. And so, acknowledging and valuing diversity. What is the vision and the mission of the organization? What sort of assessment are you doing? How are you holding yourselves accountable? Are you valuing differences in race and ethnicities and ages and religion and abilities? And so it is, as Nicole said, it's very complex. I don't think that this is my opinion, that there's one root to the problem. There's several layers and levels and complexities to the problem, and addressing, to be able to look at change. Now this is, and I would like to, let's move this on with this comment, and I'd love everyone to jump in again, is Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan donating $100 million over 10 years, putting $10 million to make a stand to promote racial equality for Black people. Social justice organizations are going to be the organizations that get this money, where he is putting this in for the long run and saying, we need to make change. We need leadership like this, but it can't just be $100 million of Michael Jordan. It's got to be more than that. So, as you said, if Verizon and Yahoo has put money into this, great, but it's also the steps and the concerted effort to be able to make change that you can measure. Anyone here, Dr. Forrester, do you have a comment to this from a business standpoint in terms of like all the different levels and the complexity to change?
I actually consider like the organizational culture has a factor that often gets overlooked. It's the idea in terms of how it shifts like the motivation. And so there's, yes, the hierarchy that might exist, but then there's also a culture that each organization will embody. You think about like RTA and the kind of culture that we have here at Ryerson. And so sometimes I think that gets like overlooked. And so when we're thinking in terms of like how to make a change and to Dan's point, like I think that culture element becomes really important. And that's why I think like, being exposed to people who don't look like you and don't sound like you might open your eyes a little bit to not have the implicit biases that therefore leads to like racism that might exist. And so like, for example, like I've been saying all week, I've been very vocal on this and very passionate, because what's happened over the last 2 weeks has forced myself and probably anyone that looks like me to really reflect on our day-to-day, or the very first instance, my first instance of being exposed to racism, being like 4 years old and having someone in my class call me the N-word. And, from that going on and how your day-to-day exists. And for people who I find who can assimilate with the majority way of culture of how things are done, perhaps their experience to overt racism might be lessened. Perhaps not necessarily with the covert style of racism, but I think that might happen. And rather than forcing people who don't act and look like the majority to assimilate, it's for the majority to have understanding. So if you're an American, and if you're in the Black culture there, Ebonics is a very formed culture way of speaking. However, that might not get you hired within the corporate world, because it might appear that you're not educated, even though that's you could have a Harvard degree and you just speak Ebonics. And so I kind of think it's a long-winded way of me answering, I think there's an organizational culture and climate that has to be accounted for when we're talking about that. And really to move that and to change that kind of environment, you got to bring like the minorities in to help like expose people to people like myself and others.
In terms of change management with the investment with Michael Jordan, this is a start. This is high profile. Of course, this comes off the heels of his documentary series, which he's, you know, a lot more out in the news these days, but he's also a leader and he's also an owner of an NBA team. So this is, you know, I'm quite interested to see how this is going to roll out, and also perhaps how organizations are going to follow suit.
Yeah, and in his case, he's had a history of staying very neutral and not political in his voice on issues, and has had backlash in the past with regards to that. So certainly it's a step, but I still think that's like one element. It's the actions behind it. And personally, I like when organizations are coming out like Nike or Reebok and making their statement, because then with this movement, this momentum that's going on, you can turn around and say, okay, like what changes, what's your action plan to implement what it is that you're saying? And the issue with Skate Canada, I think the challenge there is they're like, oh yeah, we are very diverse and accepting NSO. And then you've got a skater coming out and saying, hey, that's not been my experience. So that's a distinction. So there's the one where organizations are making the claim that we've been this is what we're doing. And, you know, you're going to get flack from that, from the athletes for sure, if that's not the case. But then I actually like the organizations that are saying that's what we believe in, that's our commitment to, because, you know, with this momentum of this movement that's in place, you can turn around and say, okay, put your money behind your words, and like maybe follow the steps that like someone like Michael Jordan has.